Record of Lodos War, Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth. That is very polysyllabic, and I had to take about 3 takes just to record that properly. This was sent to me by a longtime friend of mine who actually got me into Symphony of the Night back in the day. So it was kind of exciting to reconnect with him over this game. And it was a game that had been on my wish list for a very long time because I've heard the term Record of Lodos War. I know it's a big deal. I don't really know anything about it though. But I think that's a very valuable metric to be someone who has 0 experience with this IP. It's a long-running novel series to my understanding, and to not know what this game is. Because that means I have a fresh pair of eyes, and if you're not familiar with this series, how well is this going to appeal to you, you know? I mean, my first question is, what exactly is a Deedlit? Why is one in a Wonder Labyrinth? And what exactly is the Record of the Lodos War? Is it a 78? A single? An LP? Do I need to get the hi-fi out? And a grand total of 1 question will actually get answered in this game. Deedlit is protagonist Chan, I think. The funny thing about this game, you know, if you are someone who is inexperienced with this IP, you're unfamiliar, you don't know what a Deedlit is, going into a new thing in a long-running series could be very stressful and kind of a lot to take in. And every single new entry into a series could potentially be a great gateway if it's done right. And story-wise, this game is absolutely not that. And the funny thing is, it sets itself up perfectly to be that, and then promptly does everything in its power not to be. So here's the deal. Your character, Deedlit, is trapped in this weird dungeon place. She seems disoriented, she seems confused, she doesn't know where she is, she doesn't know why she's in this situation. You know, it's kind of your standard amnesiac protagonist situation, and that's definitely a cliche. But the thing is, it's a cliche because it works, you know? You have a character that has no perspective of what's going on so that people can inform them of what's going on so that the player who has no perspective of what's going on can then be informed of it. It's clunky, but it works, and it means that everyone gets a better grasp of what the situation is. In this game, it's handled very, very weirdly though. Like, your character is disoriented and confused, and every few rooms she'll run into a new character who then, despite the fact that she's disoriented and confused and doesn't understand anything about what's going on, seems to know the name of these characters. And then those characters will say something that's completely confusing to the character, completely baffling to the player, and then they wander off. So the fact that your character is more or less confused and an amnesiac has nothing to do with anything because she instantly knows these characters. They don't introduce themselves to you. They don't explain who they are or what their connection is. She doesn't either, in like a probably clumsy way. No, she knows who these characters are. So hopefully you do, and then hopefully you can understand what they're on about because she doesn't, and then you're just expected to keep going on. It's completely weird. Who is Parn? I can infer he's kind of important, I guess, because he's a named character, but other than that, the only thing I know about the guy is that he made me paint his roof purple that one time. I don't know who these characters are, and for a character that's designed to be sort of amnesiac about the whole situation, this might at least allow us to get some kind of flashback to get some grasp of who these characters all are, but we don't. We just know that these are characters our character seems to know, even though our character doesn't seem to know anything about what's going on. In fact, the way the story's handled might be the worst of all possible worlds for a continuation of a long-running series. Every connection to the older books and series that exists, our character seems to instantly remember, which does not benefit the player in any meaningful way, and every question she has about her current situation that we're currently experiencing never gets addressed. So even if you are familiar with the older stuff, you have no idea what's going on moving forward. And if you had no idea what was going on before, you're even more confused and disoriented as to what any of this means. It's handled in such a weird, bad way that at one point, one character that presumably was very important to her gets shanked in front of her and dies. Spoilers. And clearly our girl Deedlit here is very torn up about it, and I was mostly just confused because I wasn't even sure if we'd interacted with this character at this point, because they have 0 impact on the player. They're characters that just sort of exist for the sake of having some vague plot to push around that doesn't really engage the player in any meaningful way, and you're just left scratching your head. Now, maybe this means more if you're a fan of the series. I assume these are major characters that you probably would recognize, but even so, even if all the confusing nonsense that the player character doesn't understand is something that makes a lot of sense to you, these characters are barely here in the game. They barely interact with you. The character that had the most interaction with me was the random guy teaching me how to gamble, who showed me a giant list of instructions, and I promptly said nope and left. The other characters in this game just have no presence, despite them, I guess, being the main driving force for our character. It's really weird to have these characters not even be told that they're important to us. We just have to kind of infer based on our character's language that barely exists to begin with. Basically, don't play this game for a story because it's confusing if you're not familiar with the IP, and there's nothing here if you are. This game manages to somehow violate show don't tell, do don't show, and tell because it doesn't do any of those things. You're not told anything, you're not shown anything, you don't get to do anything that actually interacts with the plot. It's just random non sequiturs that just sort of happen at you and leave you confused. Arguably, this sets up an even bigger barrier to entry to people just getting into this. And that's on top of the barrier to entry that this is an existing IP that might make you initially assume the game expects you to know this IP, which it does. So the story makes it harder to get into this game actively. But again, it's just utterly bizarre that they set it up in such a way that it could have been a great in for anyone, and it's more confusing than anything, and it doesn't use any of the strengths of the tropes it sets up. It's very, very weird. And if you go into this with the giant overarching question being, who are these people and why should I care, the game will never have an answer for that. In terms of gameplay, the Gameplay 2 Record of Lodoss War, the very long title of Words I Barely Understand, is very much a non-linear platformer. And I guess this is where I should probably point out a bias of mine. A lot of people like to use the term metroidvania, and as I said many, many years ago now, you can't really equate those two things together because while they are at their core non-linear platformers, they have completely different design mentalities. And I very much resonate with the Metroid style more than the Castlevania style. Stuff like Symphony of the Night focused far more on character strength by building up stats through an RPG backend, whereas something like Super Metroid focused far more on being a very mechanically rich explorative experience. You could get items and power-ups through killing stuff like bosses and the like, but for the most part it was just through exploration and constantly evolving your moveset to allow you to better get around the environment, whereas the power-ups to increase your movement options in something like Symphony of the Night felt underwhelming to say the least. They were mostly just there in aid of boosting your combat ability, or if they were to get around the environment, it was something that you didn't use all that often. Like, I'm absolutely cherry-picking when I say this, but how often did you use the mist form in Symphony of the Night? Because offhand, I count 2. Whereas in Super Metroid, when you get something, you pretty much were using it all the way to the end, and the whole engagement of how the environments were designed and the exploration of it was using that in conjunction with everything you've had before that, requiring the player to develop a more explorative mindset by forcing the player to use all this stuff in conjunction, making it a lot more mechanically complex as you went. Items weren't just a weird-shaped key for a weird-shaped lock, they were an integral and necessary part so that you could get through these environments, and they might make you look at the environments a slightly different way because you have an expanding moveset. One style isn't necessarily better than the other, however, I do very much prefer the more mechanically richness of a Metroid-style game, as opposed to the more mechanically shallow combat-focused Castlevania style. And this game keeps its feet very firmly in the Castlevania camp. Most of the items you collect are more or less weird-shaped key for weird-shaped lock, and a lot of them don't get used all that much in general. It is more or less focused on getting new equipment to boost your stats to go through the game, as opposed to making a more mechanically rich moveset that allows you to create more complex interactions with the environment to get around them. And the way the environments are designed seem focused more or less on 1 or 2 obstacles that require you to use your newest thing to get to a new area, than developing a more complex moveset that must be used from beginning to end. Again, neither one of these is necessarily bad, but if you prefer one over the other, this is far more like Symphony of the Night than Super Metroid. For me personally, I think that is kind of a shame. While there isn't anything inherently wrong with picking one style over the other, for me, I've always seen that as not living up to the potential of what the game could be with these mechanics, because You have some interesting movement options and combat options in these sorts of games, but when you basically just use them as standalone experiences to move on to the next thing, I feel like you're missing out on what this could be, you know? And this is very much the same thing. In fact, ironically, a lot of the puzzles and environmental interactions in this game pretty much come down to two very basic environmental interactions that you actually have the ability to deal with from the start of the game. The first way that you interact with the environment is to take out your bow and either shoot a switch or to shoot a gear that will turn and open a thing until you go under it or it retracts. The whole thing is that you have to manage your arrows, which are controlled by your mana, as well as figuring out the direction in which to shoot. Occasionally it might mix things up and get a little bit more complex by needing to reflect your arrows into stuff, but that's really one of the biggest puzzles in this game, and it's all over the place. And while there's nothing wrong with this in particular, it does slow the game down pretty substantially, especially if you miss your shot a few times. And sometimes I found the shots to be a little bit fiddly to hit their mark. The other mechanic that this game really likes to rely on more than anything, I think is a lot more mechanically interesting, and that is the power of the spirits. It's actually a stealth Ikaruga sequel, of all things. Very early on, our girl Deedlit will pick up a sylph and a salamander, a fire and wind elemental that allows her to swap between those two elements. This will change the nature of her attacks in terms of elemental damage. This will change what kind of element she can guard across, which allows her to cross different barriers of different elemental damage just fine. And she can actively upgrade and bolster both elements individually. The elements go even further than that as well, because when you hit an enemy enough times with one element, you get sort of a temporary experience towards the other, and you can level it up to level 3. I don't know what level 2 actually does. I don't think it actually does anything, if I'm being honest. However, if you hit level 3 and you take damage, if you swap that element, it will passively recover you over time. Although if you take damage while you're recovering, you'll lose that experience and drop your level down. It's really just an added perk for doing really well. You kind of get a get out of jail free card just in utilizing your strength with one element to allow you to survive a little bit longer. They also have different movement options, such as the sylph allowing you to slightly hover, which is pretty cool. And this actually does also lead to probably one of the better examples of a 2-on-1 boss fight I've ever seen. On a moment-to-moment basis, modify your elements so that you don't take damage while actively dealing damage to your opponents. I like that a lot. It was done really, really well. However, it should be noted that there are more than 2 elements in this game, but there's no mechanical interaction between any of it. From what I've found, there is exactly one way to interact with these other elements, and it basically requires you to go and find a specific attack that is hidden somewhere in the world, and there seems to be like one for every element, but using it drains a huge amount of mana, and you need to save that stuff, so it's nowhere near as convenient as just fire and wind, which are available to you at any time. You don't have any way to really get into actively using other elements, because outside of these hard to find singular special abilities you can find, there's no way to interact with it. If you look in the lower right hand corner, you'll see a bunch of dice next to any monster's name. This is some kind of elemental resistance symbol. Like, the higher the dice roll, the more resistant they are to a specific element. But you'll also notice that there's more than wind and fire damage out there. There's also like a light and a dark, and I think a water element as well, but you have no meaningful way to interact with any of it. So that displaying on your enemy information sheet in the corner is really just an extra glut of information that bogs down the entire GUI and serves to create no mechanical purpose other than to just confuse the player. Say you're a new player. You know you have a fire and water element, but you see a completely different element right down there. What are you supposed to do? Are you supposed to ignore these enemies while you look for a different element that doesn't exist for your abilities? It's just a weird excess of information that just feels like style over substance and actively hurts the player experience. Eventually you'll get to bosses, and I will say that the bosses in this game are awesome. They're huge, they're menacing, they kind of have like a faux 3D effect to them. Some of them hang out in the background and attack the foreground. They are exciting, and you never know what's going to happen. I definitely think that the bosses in this game are the biggest highlight of the gameplay itself. Other than that, it's a pretty standard affair. You pick up new abilities to explore new areas, you utilize the abilities you have to find those new abilities, and you slowly uncover the map and find new bosses that proceed to kind of allude to a plot you don't get to actually take part in. It works more or less fine, although I do feel, like I said at the top, that this game isn't quite using mechanical complexity it could, and it's sort of missing out on what this game ultimately could be. Ultimately, the gameplay to Wonder Labyrinth and the series of words I don't really recognize is, at its core, a fairly fun game, especially if you're more into the Castlevania style of these sort of games, because it does have its feet firmly planted in that camp. For me, it feels like it's not quite hitting the potential it's creating for itself. I should note, though, if you are the person who wants a longer game that's more bang for your buck, it is a fairly short game. I beat this initially in under 4 hours first time I played, and I think I saw pretty much everything there was to see in this game. It's a smaller game for sure, but it does work for what it needs to. But at the same time, I can't help but feel like it's not hitting its potential, and the fact that it is so short kind of compounds that issue more, you know? It's like there is so much more here you could do with this. The overall presentation to Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth, I actually got the name vaguely right that time, is excellent. Honestly, I think the presentation to this game is its highest points. The visuals are fantastic. The animation on Deedlit herself is tremendous, and it's just beautiful to watch. And the soundtrack sounds great. There's not really anything that stands out to me about it necessarily, but I do think in general it was very high quality. And in terms of presentation overall, it was tremendous. Now, if you want a copy of Record of Lotus War Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth on Steam, it is available for $23. And I'm not gonna lie, that is a bit pricey for what you get here, especially for the length if you're bothered to buy that. And I have to give a huge shout out and thank you to someone who wishes to remain anonymous, but it was an old friend of mine who actually kind of got me into Symphony of the Night in the first place. So this was kind of a neat little sort of experience coming back to where it started a little bit for me. But this game does feel a little bit expensive for what you get, especially in terms of its overall length, if that's a big factor for you. So I would probably recommend you get it on sale. That said, it is a high quality experience, but get the feeling it's not doing all it could for what it is. In terms of story, it could be a great entry point for people, but this game seems to actively ignore having a story in general, and leaves both the player character and the player more confused than informed. It could be a very mechanically interesting and dense game, but it ends up being more shallow, and not just because it seems to follow the Symphony of the Night mentality of equipment and ability progression. The elemental defense Ikaruga style of swapping elements and stuff, and the fact that they've got individual experience points for that end up feeding you into more survivability, that's brilliant, and I feel like they could expand on that greatly. And yet, it feels like the elements themselves don't really come into any sort of mechanical play. You're not really using your fire to burn anything down, or your wind to, I don't know, activate some sails instead of just having to shoot the same gears with your arrows over and over again. I feel like there's so much this game could be doing more than what it is, and it's frustrating to see that kind of potential in a game that just doesn't achieve it. I wouldn't recommend it at $23 because it is more or less a short game, but I think Record of Lotus War Deedlit in Wonder Labyrinth is a fun, bite-sized platformer. If you're okay with a smaller experience that's done in a few hours, this one will do it for you, and it'll be fun. But it can't help but make me feel longing for what this game potentially could have been. And not just because maybe I want to actually know what the story to Record of Lotus War is, and this gave me next to nothing about it, but I can't help but wonder what more it could have been.